Yeah.
It's not coming through your ear.
Oh, it's not? Okay.
Also, you're still unmuted, Paul, just as a heads up.
Okay, hold
Yeah,
on.
watch what you say, Paul.
Okay, I will.
Before you start,
What'd you say, George?
I have a question before you start.
Yeah, for sure.
Now that I have, I'm not running around, I had time to really think about the whole Bereshit. Not the subject, but the book of Bereshit. It seems like there's trouble between every brother
This is
all
great.
the way through.
We're going to discuss this today. I think
What does
that's a
that
great
mean?
point.
What is the Torah telling us?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and hopefully we can return back to that at the end of this year. I think that's part of what we want to discuss today. I think that's a really excellent point. I'm glad you brought it up. I think there's no way that we could have finished Sefer Bereshit together without bringing up that point.
Yeah, you would expect that at least the foundation of Judaism, of Ivri, and they're not getting along. Why? And they're brothers.
Yeah, it's a great point. Let's use George's pre-share question as a springboard to jump into share. I think it's a great point. George is asking, and really I think this is a good frame for what we're going to discuss today. George is pointing out that we're about to finish Vayechi, the last Parsha in Bereshit. And now that we're getting to the end of Bereshit, we're finishing the first book of the Torah, the first book of the Bible. We've read about the Jewish family, the first Jewish family. And really, more than anything, it's characterized by fighting and by sibling rivalry and familial infighting. What's going on there? It's such a strange way for the story to be told, such a strange way for the Jewish nation, for God's nation, for God's mission to be introduced to the world. What exactly is going on there? I think that's a great question. And it's something I want to look at today a little bit. I want to look at a few things today, but primarily what I want to discuss, and I think this
starts with Cain and Abel, the very first.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. One of the very first stories we get in the Torah right after Adam and Eve is Cain and Abel, which is sibling rivalry. And one of the very last things we hear in the Torah, and what I want to start by focusing on today, is the rivalry or tension or reversal of Ephraim and Menashe, Yosef's sons. So Yosef, we know, has two sons, Ephraim and Menashe. And despite Menashe being the older son, Ephraim is chosen by Yaakov to be given the birthright of the firstborn. And again, like George was pointing out, this is just Yaakov heightening sibling tension, heightening sibling rivalry once more. That the first family, the Jewish leadership, patriarchal family, is just plagued by all this competition. So I want to discuss a little bit what's going on in this scene where we have Ephraim and Menashe actually getting this first bracha, getting their brachot, where we have this final reversal, this final sibling rivalry going on. To look at that in its own context, to look at that in the broader context of Sefer Bereshit, and then to look at that in perhaps a more localized context of what it means for the Yaakov and Yosef story that's being wrapped up today. So hopefully we'll answer George's question, or raise a few more, and we'll answer all of them today and share. So given that introduction, I think we can now jump in, starting with the first source. Sorry, the numbering didn't come through. But we're just going to go over the story of Ephraim and Menashe together. First, we'll read the story inside. We'll point out some things here and there. Then we'll ask some bigger questions and try and flesh it out together. So as usual, we'll start the psukim. So the Torah says, following the little red fuzzy dot in the first source, Vayhi achrei dvarim ha'ila, v'yomer liYosef, hinei avicha chola. So as after the big reunion, after Yaakov and his sons came down to Egypt, they had the reunion with Yosef. Yosef gave them Goshen, everything's going great for the Jews. After all that happened, v'yomer liYosef, it was told to Yosef, hinei avicha chola, your father is sick. Yikach shnei banav imo, Yosef takes his two sons with him, Ephraim and Menashe, et Menashe ve'et Ephraim. V'yagin leYaakov, and Yaakov's told that Yosef is coming with his two sons. V'yomer, hinei bincha Yosef ba'elecha. And they said to Yaakov, your son Yosef is coming. Yitchazik Yisrael v'yeshev al hamita. And Israel and Jacob, now referred to by his name Israel, and one of the things to pay attention to throughout this section, we're not going to discuss it too much, but I'm open to insights or comments on it, is the constantly changing names. Sometimes he's Yaakov, sometimes he's Israel. Sometimes it's Jacob, sometimes it's Israel. So here we have an instance of it being called Israel. So first it's Ve'aged Yaakov. Yaakov is told that Yosef is coming, but then it's Yitzchazek Yisrael. Israel is the one who is strengthened. The Yeshev al Mita. He sits up on his bed. Vayom Yaakov Yosef, Kel Shaddai, Nirai Lai, Beluz, Beretz Canaan, Vayvarech Oti. And Yaakov tells Yosef something which we, the reader, don't know. Does everybody know? Did Yaakov tell everyone already? Is he just repeating it for a dramatic effect? Is this a big reveal that the siblings didn't even know yet? Yaakov comes and says, God revealed himself to me. I think this doesn't get enough play for the drama of it. Because on the one hand, it could be that this is not a big deal. Maybe Yaakov told the brothers, he told all the siblings already, and he's just repeating it to sort of set the stage. But on the other hand, God has not appeared to any of the siblings. In fact, notably, God has not appeared to Yosef. God's only spoken to Yosef through dreams. So when Yaakov sits down with Yosef and says, God has appeared to me, that's a pretty hefty statement. God appeared to Yaakov, he appeared to Yitzchak, he appeared to Abraham, but none of the brothers have had a vision of God. Who's going to take the realm of spiritual leadership? Who is God going to appear to next? I think there's really a lot going on when Yaakov sits down with Yosef and says, God appeared to me in Israel and Luz. Because perhaps the brothers already know this family history. Perhaps they already know that God, Yud-Keh, Vav-Keh, is their God, and he revealed himself to their forefathers. But here the emphasis is particularly poignant. I have a direct relationship with God, but none of you do. None of the brothers have ever spoken directly with God in any way. So God appeared to me in Luz, and he gave me a blessing. That's what Yaakov opens up with. And that also significant, of course, is this idea of God giving a blessing to Yaakov. We know that after the death of each of the previous patriarchs, / at the beginning of each patriarch's story, God blesses them. God blesses Abraham very early on in this stage, and he'll be fruitful and multiply, etc. God blesses Yitzchak right after the death of Abraham, and God blesses Yaakov right after he leaves Yitzchak's household. The bracha, the blessing, is not just the blessing of material wealth, but it's God's stamp of approval. That this person, this patriarch, is now the leader of my nation, the leader of my religion, carrying out my divine mission. So Yaakov is saying, I had that moment with God, and he blessed me. But more than that, that's setting the stage now for who's going to take over now that Yaakov is dying. Who's going to be the next person to be blessed? Who will carry Birchat Abraham, Abraham's blessing that assures him the land of Israel and the nation of the Jewish people? Who will be the inheritor amongst the 12 brothers? But Yomer Eli, and just to point out, at this point, the brothers think one of them is going to get it, but they don't know that it's going to be shared. So far, the model has been that on the deathbed, the Jewish father passes on to his favorite son, the first right, the Bechorah. Abraham passes to Yitzchak, excluding Ishmael. Yitzchak passes on to Yaakov through the drama of stealing the bracha with Esav. And now the brothers are under the impression that Yaakov is going to pick one of them. Now, given that impression, Yaakov calls Yosef first. Yosef surely is thinking, I earned it, I deserved it, I'm providing for my family, I'm providing for Egypt. Now's the moment. I'm going to be made king, I'm going to be made leader of the Jewish people, my children will be the leader of the nation going forward, etc. And that's what we think is happening. Yaakov opens up in the way we'd expect by saying, I have this special gift, this familial tradition from God, passed down from Abraham and Yitzchak, and it's the bracha of Hashem. So Yosef now is presumably anticipating the news that he's the lucky winner of the Bechorah. He's going to be selected to carry on Birchat Abraham, Abraham's blessing. But Yomer Eli, God said to me, Hineni mafrecha verbeticha, v'nataticha lekal amim, v'natati et eretz hazeh l'zarecha acharecha chuzat olam. God told me he was going to multiply me and give me the land of Israel as an inheritance for future generations. V'yeta, and now, Pasuk Hey, verse 5, Shnei vanecha noldim lecha beretz Mitzrayim, et bo yelechem Mitzrayima li heim. So now all of a sudden Yaakov pivots. He opens up by saying, God promised me Israel and appeared to me and gave me a blessing. And now all of a sudden he says, now your two sons, hanoldim lecha beretz Mitzrayim. Yaakov emphasizes, who were born in Egypt, ad bo yelechem Mitzrayim, and they were born before I came to Egypt, li heim, they're mine. In other words, says Yaakov, those two sons, you had Ephraim and Manasseh, you might think that they're born in a distant, faraway land, not part of the family. Don't worry, Lihaim, not just are they mine, not only do I recognize them as my legitimate grandchildren, but I'm going to make them Shvatim. They're going to be considered my children and not your children. They'll be ascended up the ranks. They won't just be grandchildren of Jacob, they'll be children of Jacob, and Ephraim and Manasseh will be amongst the 12 tribes. So that's what Yaakov is assuring. Yosef, your children will be treated as if they're tribes. Ephraim and Manasseh, Ruvain v'Shimon yuli. Ephraim and Manasseh will be like Ruvain and Shimon. What does Yaakov mean that Ephraim and Manasseh will be like Ruvain and Shimon? Anyone have any suggestion? Why is Yaakov saying specifically they'll be like Ruvain and Shimon?
That's what they mean.
Open it to the floor while I take a drink.
Part of the tribe. They're part of the tribes.
For sure. They're part of the tribes. That's a great point. He's saying you'll be part of the tribes like Ruvain and Shimon. But I think he's emphasizing something specific when he says Ruvain and Shimon. Because when the rest of the tribes, Reuben and Shimon were the first two children born of the 12 tribes.
Right.
In other words, one would have thought that Reuben, and if not Reuben, maybe Shimon, would be the ones to inherit the birthright. They would get the firstborn, the Bechorah, the birthright, the double portion. But instead, what do we find? Which of the brothers is ultimately going to be receiving 2 portions in Jacob's inheritance?
Joseph.
Which of the brothers will have 2 tribal claims to Israel? Yosef. Because through his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, he will now get a double portion because his 2 sons are being elevated to the position of tribes. So he will get a double portion. So I think what Yaakov is communicating is, how is it they'll be like Reuben and Shimon? You will get the double portion of the firstborn. Not Reuben, the actual firstborn, not Shimon, the secondborn, but you, Yosef, now will be receiving a double portion. Ultimately, we know that while Reuben and Shimon were disqualified from the Bechorah, from the firstborn, due to their own personal sins, ultimately, the kingship, the Malchut, falls to the third person in line, Yehuda. While Yosef might get the Pi Shnayim, the double stake of land in the land of Israel, Yehuda, Judah, as the son who doesn't get disqualified, is ultimately going to be the one to inherit the kingship and the leadership of Israel. Well, I think what's being expressed here is that Yaakov is finally giving Yosef his material right as a Bechorah, his double portion of the land as the firstborn or as the favorite son, but he's not giving him more than that. Despite the opening, despite the framing of I have a blessing from God, Yaakov does not then go on to give Yosef a special blessing. Yosef does not go on to have a special vision from God. Rather, what we have is Yaakov assuring Yosef, you'll receive your material inheritance. You will get a double portion of land. Perfect. So that's what we're up to now, that the Ephraim and Manasseh will be like Reuben and Shimon. And of course, as always, if anyone has any questions or comments while I'm reading, please feel free to jump in, interrupt me. Don't wait for me to call on you, because while I share screen, I can't see everybody.
Okay.
Yeah, Joel, what were you saying?
Well, Ephraim, later on, like in the VM, is often used as a synonym for Yisrael, like the northern kingdom. So it's like Ephraim not only has a tribal inheritance, but is seen in some ways as representative of all the kingdom of Israel.
Of course. So yeah, Joel's raising a great point that Ephraim ends up being the stand-in for the people of Israel, which are the 10 tribes, which split off from the people of Judah, the Judah and Binyamin, the 2 tribes that don't really that stick together around the temple site. And Ephraim ends up being the leader of, or the at least in the prophet's words, Ephraim ends up being the Medanim, the example chosen to represent the entirety of the Jews of Israel. And we shouldn't go into this now, but just to plant the seed of something maybe one day we'll explore in a different Shiurim set. It's no coincidence that what we find being the main drama that plays out through Nevi'im, through the later parts of the Bible, is the tension between the children of Leah and the children of Rachel. That we have the tribe of Israel as epitomized by Ephraim, by Yosef's firstborn, in competition with the tribe of Judah, which is, of course, epitomized by Judah, the leader who isn't disqualified from Leah's children. Now, of course, Judah and Binyamin are actually intermixed, so it's a little bit more complicated than that, because Judah is not Judah without the land of Binyamin, which is where the temple is found, etc. But nonetheless, we see that in terms of how the prophets view it, at least, and how it's described as, again, the sibling rivalry of Judah versus Yosef versus Ephraim, of Rachel versus Leah, and really, again, touching on what George was describing, this familial drama between sister wives, between siblings. That's really the drama of the entirety of Tanakh. Not just Genesis, but it plays out even in the kingships and the split kingships, etc., something we'll hopefully discuss whenever our share gets around to Nevi'im. But for now, we're starting with Bereshit, so we got a long way to go. So what we see so far, perfect, that the 2 tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh will be will be given precedence as normal tribes, and Yosef through that will receive his Pi Shnayim, his double portion as a Bechor, as the special privileged son. And the children which were born to you after Ephraim and Manasseh, those are yours. And they shall be according to their brother's name in inheritance. Very interesting idea. So it says Yaakov, and I think to me this was shocking. Yaakov says, Yosef, you might have other children, but they're not tribes. Only Ephraim and Manasseh are considered tribes. So I just want to point out, and we'll discuss this as we look through this a little closer. But one, what does Yaakov mean you have other children? Shouldn't we know that? Shouldn't we have heard about it? What other children are there? Isn't it just Ephraim and Manasseh? And 2, if it's not just Ephraim and Manasseh, why are Ephraim and Manasseh the 2 that get the bracha? What's going on here? Why is Yaakov saying you might have other children, but they're not included? they just get inheritance with Ephraim and Manasseh. So that's something else I'd like to look into together. We'll get there. But just for now, planting the question. Now, Pasuk Zion, verse 7 here. Va'ani, and I, Yaakov, bevoi Padan, when I was coming from Padan Aram, from Lavan's house, Meta alai Rachel be'eretz Canaan b'derech. Your mother Rachel died along the path, along the journey, ba'od kivrat aretz lavo Ephrata, before we arrived at Ephrat, ve'akbara sham b'derech Ephrat, hi Beit Lechem. And she was buried on the way to Ephrat and Beit Lechem. What is going on here? All of a sudden, Yaakov is talking to Yosef, and he tells Yosef, I was given a special blessing from God that was passed to me from my forefathers. I'm going to give your children a double portion in Israel. Seems like so far he's saying, I'm going to give you some special treatment. You're going to get some form of blessing or some form of double inheritance. And then all of a sudden he says, by the way, remember how your mother died while we were traveling to Beit Lechem? What is that? Why does Yaakov all of a sudden, with no transition, with no explanation, mention the death of Rachel? Why does he bring it up here? And then all of a sudden, the next pasuk, the next verse, he just changes the topic again. And then Israel sees Joseph's children and says, who are these people? He doesn't explain why he mentioned Rachel. He doesn't have any sort of explanation here. He just mentions it and moves on. So I'm open. I wonder if anyone has any theories, any ideas as to what it's serving here, what's going on here. If not, we'll discuss, develop a little more. I'll tell you my theory, but I want to put it to the floor a little first. Does anyone have any idea, any suggestion? What is going on here? Why is Yaakov mentioning the death of Rachel, her burial on the side of the road, in the middle of discussing with Yosef the blessing and the inheritance he'll receive?
About it, and we don't have a Torah here to get a note. We
No,
don't have.
I just
Maybe
have
that's
your
fine.
book.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
I mean, clearly Rachel was his beloved.
Torah portion.
Also have the stone.
Yeah, that's a good point.
No, but
That
you-
perhaps part of what's going on here is almost like a justification of why
I mean,
Yosef.
it was so important, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's an interesting idea. Maybe the point here is just to point out how much Yaakov loved Rachel, to say, Yosef, this is why it's so important to me.
This is the chapter. This is.
Chapter 48.
Genesis
That's
48.
an interesting idea.
48:7, because I know that you know something, Rabbi. I'm glad you said that, because even in all my what I look up my midrash, I don't have at my fingertips. That's a good question. I never questioned that verse.
I'm glad.
One of those things you just read right on past.
Yeah. So I think what Paul is raising is a good point, that part of what we're doing here is emphasizing the connection to Rachel. But even the connection to Rachel doesn't really sufficiently explain it. Because if what Yaakov was trying to do is to say, Yosef, the reason why you get special treatment is because I loved Rachel so much, then shouldn't he say, and I really loved your mother Rachel? Instead of saying, oh, and your mother Rachel died before we made it into Israel on the road. Sort of a strange thing to communicate, a little bit unexpected, a little bit random.
You know, I have a little bit of a note here. It says that Rachel died on the deathbed. Jacob recalls his beloved wife who died so young, who endured so much.
Interesting.
Maybe it's just he's recalling. Maybe it's just that here he is with his grandchildren / he takes as his children, but who also would have been Rachel's. And this is as he's just remembering Rachel, obviously Joseph's mother, who he didn't really know much time. And he's recalling, and don't forget her. You know,
I think that's like a very interesting perspective, that part of what's being communicated here is family history, that this is your mother, this is your grandmother, don't forget her.
and
Personally, I think it's
buried. Really
Yeah.
important. That's a really important point because of what happens later in her merit.
This is great. So part of what's being expressed here is not just don't forget your mother, but don't forget where she's buried. Some kind of significance on her kever, on her burial, and her burial spot. Spot on, and something I want to explore later. Yeah, George.
He purchased that land, and that was a land in Israel. And this gives him ownership of that land, and the people who follow him ownership of that land.
Wait a second. Did he purchase that land?
Yeah, exactly. He did. In fact, George is pointing out something I wish I had the psukim in front of me to point out. But when Jacob buys the land for Rachel, much like when Abraham buys land for Sarah, the Torah tells us explicitly he bought it for me'ach suta kesef. however
Okay.
much that is.
Rabbi,
So
Rabbi,
it's-
do you remember which pasuk that's in?
I don't, I'm sorry. If you flip back a couple chapters, you'll come across it. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'm happy to look up after this
And I
year.
can actually, whoa, I think I can.
Yeah. So if we pointed out when it came up in Parshat year that the parallel there between that and the purchase of Marat Machpelah, which Abraham purchased for Sarah, sort of indicates that what's going on here is a significant purchase of land in Israel. And that part of the connotations and significance of what the Parsha is explicating to us is that this should be seen as our receipt for the land of Israel. So George is saying if part of what's important about Kever Rachel, part of what's important about Rachel's burial isn't just the burial, but rather that creating a home for burial is a statement of living in a land and owning a land, a statement of being a real citizen resident there, then what we're saying is Yaakov's not just saying, remember Rachel, but specifically, remember Rachel's burial spot. Because there's something about the claim to the land, about the relationship to Israel that's being expressed by emphasizing Rachel's burial. I think that's spot on, and that's also something I want to explore together.
When did Rachel die?
All right.
No, Rachel, that's not, he's remembering. This is
Oh.
not when Rachel
Oh,
died.
he's
He's remembering.
Okay.
But Rachel died on the way. But Rachel was introduced to Esau with all the kids. So
Yeah.
it didn't happen then, but it happened. And then her nurse, Rebecca, died earlier.
Yeah, it'd have to be at the end of Vayishlach, the end of Parshat Vayishlach.
Okay, Vayechi.
Yeah. So you can let us know if you find anything interesting there. For now, we'll carry on. But what we see is this puzzling idea of why Rachel's death is mentioned. Paul mentioned, of course, in some extent, it's a special privileged place that Yosef has. Lindy and David are pointing out that it's not just that, but it's the burial specifically. And George's explanation, partial explanation at least, to explain why the burial is so important, is highlighting how the burial is actually a recorded instance of purchasing land in the land of Israel, one of only 2 instances in all the Bible so far, and that itself perhaps might be a significant thing to reference on a deathbed. That's the land I own, here's the receipts, here's the deed, you're inheriting that land. Perfect. So now that all takes us to verse 8. Yosef v'yomer mi elah. Now Jacob sees his grandchildren and he says, who are these people? It's left ambiguous if this is like a rhetorical question. Is Jacob being playful or friendly when he says mi elah? Or is he actually meeting his grandchildren for the very first time? Or is he perhaps so declined in vision or mental acuity or whatever it might be that he's not recognizing them? All those are possible. We're not told. All we are told is that Jacob asks, who are these people? So in response, Vayomer Yosef, Joseph responds to that question and says, Vayomer Yosef el Aviv, Banai. So they are my children. Asher natan li Elohim bazeh, which God has given me bazeh. How does the English here translate it? How does Sepharia translate it? I'm curious. Joseph says, his fathers, they are my sons whom God has given me here. Fascinating. We'll explore what exactly this verse means, bazeh. But he says, they're my children whom God has given me bazeh, with this, or here as English translates it. Vayomer, and Jacob responds, kachem na elai va'avarachem. Take them and bring them to me, and I will bless them. Ve'enei Yisrael kavdu mizoken. And similar to what we heard about Yitzchak at the end of his life, so too Jacob, his eyes had become heavy, they'd become weakened at the end of his life. Lo yuchal nerot, he was no longer able to see. Vayegasho tam elav, vayishak lehem, vayichabech lehem. So they had to be brought to him, and then once they were brought close to each other, he kissed and hugged them. Vayomer Yisrael Yosef, and Jacob said to Joseph, Ra'o fanecha lo filalti, v'yinei harauti Elohim gam et zarecha. He says to him, I can't see, I never thought I'd see your face again, and here I am with your children. A very emotional moment. Yaakov thought that Yosef was dead, and now he's meeting his grandchildren. V'yotze Yosef otam me'im berkav, v'yishtachu lapav arza. So Yosef then removed his grandchildren from Yaakov's knees, where they were standing, I guess, out of a sign of respect, and he bowed low to his face to the ground out of respect for his father. Vayikach Yosef et shneim et Ephraim b'yamino v'smol Yisrael v'Menashe b'smolo v'yamin Yisrael v'yigash elav. And Yosef takes the sons, and now we're being told that he's placing them in specific places. Menashe is being placed on Jacob's right, Yosef's left, and Ephraim, the younger son, is being placed on Jacob's left, Yosef's right. V'yishlach Yisrael yamino v'yashed al rosh Ephraim v'hu hatzir v'smolo al rosh Menashe shikel et yadav ki Menashe habachor. And Jacob goes and crosses his arms, switches who gets the right hand, the right, of course, being the primary hand and the primary bracha, the primary blessing. One would expect it would go to Menashe, the firstborn, but instead it goes to Ephraim, the younger son. So we have Yosef leads the children up to Yaakov. We're told Yaakov's blind. So Yosef placing them is going to presumably be where they stand. But Yaakov, despite his lack of vision, intuits, surely Yosef doesn't see this. Surely Yosef is putting the Bechor, the firstborn, into my right hand. So I must flip across my hands. Nowhere do the verses tell us that Yaakov's informed that Menashe is under his right hand. He does it on his own. He knows on his own to cross his hands. Then we see.
How does Yosef know who's going to get which bracha and he switches hands?
Great question. How does Yosef know who's going to get the bracha? So it seems like Yosef is still under the assumption that the Bechor, the firstborn, should get the bracha. And George is highlighting something I really want to emphasize here. I think part of what's being communicated here is the difference in expectations or assumptions between Yaakov and Yosef. The Torah just told us that Yaakov's blind. He can't see what's going on. And yet, nevertheless, the Torah tells us Yaakov knew that he had to cross his hands. I think what's being communicated here is a difference in expectation and outlook between Yaakov and Yosef. Yaakov knows that Yosef's perspective on life and Yosef's assumption is still in the world where the Bechor will win out. Yosef, the Bechor of Rachel, the firstborn will still get primogeniture, get their privilege, become the most powerful in the family. There will be one individual leader of the Jewish people, of the nation, of every family, and that's the firstborn. So naturally, Yosef takes the firstborn and puts it under Yaakov's right hand. But Yaakov knows that his son Yosef has that perspective. It's no surprise that Yosef, the viceroy of Egypt, is thinking that the future of the Jewish people is going to be salvation from one leader, one strong political leader in the family who will lead all of them. But that's not what Yaakov's envisioning. Yaakov isn't envisioning a traditional, feudalist, primogeniture system with one empowered firstborn taking care of everybody else. He understands that we're shifting now to a tribal setup. There's going to be multiple tribes and multiple leaders. And moreover, like we see, and we'll get to this throughout Tanakh, it's not so obvious that the firstborn, that birthright, should determine who leads, and not accomplishments and actions should determine who leads. So when the Torah tells us that Jacob crossed his hands without being able to see even, it's telling us that what's going on here are different perspectives. Jacob knows Yosef is going to put the older son under his right hand, and without even having to ask, he knows it's going to happen and knows to cross his hands to send a message to Yosef. To communicate to Yosef, you thought this is how it's working. Let me tell you, things are about to be very, very different. Therefore, he crosses his hands. Does that make sense to everybody? What we have here is a clear difference in perspective being communicated between Yaakov and Yosef. Yeah? So now, I wanted to finish the whole thing and go back, but honestly, now that we brought it out so much, and thank you, George, for pointing that out, well, I want to flesh out a little bit here from the literary perspective, just to appreciate what's going on here. Because as George opened the class with, the question George opened the class with, all of the Torah so far has been about sibling rivalry, has been about competition. And that's passed on basically through only Abraham is spared, and one of his siblings dies. But Yitzchak and Ishmael, Yaakov and Esau, the brothers, there's this family rivalry. And Yaakov, as we said, is not ignorant to this. He's not shielded from it. Yaakov has perhaps the most intense rivalry of any of the siblings, except perhaps his own. Yaakov has to flee out of fear that his brother will kill him. Yaakov tricks his brother and steals his blessing. Yaakov meets his brother and beforehand has to send a military parade out of fear for his life. Yaakov has experienced so much tension with his brother. But I think when we get to this scene with Ephraim and Menashe in front of him, when Yaakov goes and says he's going to cross his hands and give the Bechorah to the younger sibling, when Yaakov recognizes that the birthright should follow the older sibling, Yaakov is affirming the decisions he's made in his life. Yaakov is confronting again his drama with Esau. This is the drama all over again. Should the oldest sibling be the one to get blessed? So Yaakov is now culminating the story of the patriarchs, the story of the Torah, and that's a story of subversion of the right of the firstborn. Because what the Torah is trying to communicate to us right here, and what it's trying to communicate with Cain and Hevel, what it's trying to communicate with Yitzchak and Yishmael, with Esau and Yaakov, is that you're not born into spiritual leadership. Your actions merit that position. You're not born into a relationship with God, but the things you do develop a relationship with God. And so Yaakov, capping off the family history, the last of the children of Abraham to get a story in Bereshit, makes the statement and affirms, I made the right choice all those years ago. I was right to trick Esav. I was right to take the Bechorah. I was right to do all those things, because that's the story of the Jewish people, that it's not about the birthright, but it's about the actions you do. So Yaakov and the Rabbi say it's because he saw that Ephraim would be greater, again, emphasizing one's actions and not one's birthright. Yaakov, seeing Ephraim will be a greater child, seeing he'll do more, crosses his hands and communicates to Yosef and to the future of the Jewish people that the story of my tension with Esav, the story of Yitzchak and Ishmael, it's not just a story of family rivalry, but it's a story of actions versus birthright. That what you do in this world is more important than who you're born to, what your family, race, ethnicity, background is. And that's solidified, that's communicated in the reversal here. And as George said, the continual reversal throughout the story. That continually, the younger son is in tension and ultimately prevails over the older son throughout Bereshit. Because we're trying to get the message as we're meeting humanity for the very first time. Seeing its highs and its lows, meeting the characters who are picked to ultimately save humanity from depravity, introduce religion, divinity, holiness. What we're meeting is the human condition. And what we're learning is that humanity might think, and what might have been prevailing in the time the Torah was given, that birthright is super important. Primogeniture, the firstborn should get all the land, who you're born to, royalty, all those things really matter. But the Torah's telling us no, that's not true. What matters is what you do and the actions you take. So I think given that context, we can really appreciate the Ephraim Menashe story as the capstone, as the kickoff message, as the finalization, not kickoff, but the finalization of the message that's been developing throughout the story. That's not about your birthright, it's about what you do. So all of that gets us back into the psukim, that now we have Yaakov teaching Yosef this important lesson. Yosef brings him his sons, and Yaakov, without even asking, knows to switch his hands. V'yivarech et Yosef vayomar, and Yaakov blesses Yosef first and says, Elohim asher talchu avotai lefanav Avraham Yitzchak, Elohim hara oti ma'odi ad hayom hazeh. The God who walked with your forefathers Avraham and Yitzchak, the God who shepherds me until today. Again, opening with this tradition of Avraham and Yitzchak. Hamalach goel oti mikol ra, the angel who protected me from ill. Yivarech et ne'arem, he should bless these children. Yikara behem shemi, call them by my name, Hashem avotai Avraham Yitzchak, by the name of my forefathers Abraham and Isaac. V'yidgu l'ro b'kerev haaretz, and they should multiply within the land. So we have here a blessing of multiplication, much like the blessing that's ultimately given to Abraham, given to Isaac, given to Jacob by God. But we don't have a reference of ruling or dominion over the land of Israel. And more than that, we have this reference, V'yidgu l'ro, your children shall multiply and be many, b'kerev haaretz, in the midst of the land. Which land? Yosef's living in Egypt. He's one of the rulers of Egypt. It's a little bit ambiguous, and I think it's intentionally lacking. It's striking that Israel isn't mentioned here at all. Jacob doesn't tell that Yosef, oh, your children will get a double inheritance in Israel. He doesn't tell Joseph, oh, your children should be leaders in Israel. He just says your children should have many kids and multiply in the land. But he doesn't mention the national claim to Israel as the land of the Jewish people. So I think that's interesting and striking, something to keep in mind. Yosef saw that Jacob had put his right hand on Ephraim, the younger son's head, and it was bad in his eyes. And Yosef, seeing that his father is blind, figured it's a mistake. I'll just switch it around for him. So Yosef goes and switches Jacob's hands. Vayomer Yosef al Aviv lo chen avi. So Yosef says to his father, it's not so. You shouldn't put your right hand on Ephraim's head. Ki zeh bachor. This is the firstborn. Simi mincha rosho, put your hand on his head. Jacob says, I know. Gam hu yelam, he'll also be great. He'll also be a nation. Gam hu yigdal, he'll be large. But his younger brother will be greater than him. And his children will fill up the nations. So we have here the message communicated. It doesn't matter who you're born to, it matters what you'll do. Jacob blesses them on that day, Lemor, saying, through you, Israel, or the nation of Israel will bless their children, saying, Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'Menashe. God should make you like Ephraim and Menashe. Yasim et Ephraim v'Bnei Menashe. And Yaakov placed Ephraim before Menashe. Vayomer Yisrael Yosef Hinei Anochi. So just to make a side point, my whole life growing up, my dad always gives me this bracha Friday night. I think many people have that custom that parents will bless their children. That you say either for the sons, Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'Menashe. For the daughters, Yisimech Elohim ke'Sarah Rivka Rachel Leah. I think it's very beautiful, and I think it's very beautiful that we have a blessing both for daughters and sons. I will point out that given the context, I think what's being expressed here of Ephraim and Menashe is a very pointed point. Jacob's not just saying you should be as great as these great people, especially because as far as we know, Ephraim and Menashe are hardly the greatest heroes in the Bible. Like there's Abraham, there's Moses, there's all these huge figures. Why are we blessing you should be like Ephraim and Menashe? I think what the blessing is trying to communicate is exactly what Yaakov is trying to communicate to Yosef. The significance of what's going on here, the significance of Ephraim and Menashe, is that Yaakov is recognizing Ephraim for his actions and not for his birthright. And what we're saying in this blessing, that you should be like Ephraim and Menashe, placing Ephraim first, is that you, my son, my daughter, my child, should be judged by your merits and your actions and what you contribute to this world, the positivity you bring into this world, and not by your birthright or by things beyond your control. In other words, I don't think it's just a blessing, you should be as great as these great people, but it's a statement of Ein Mazal Yisrael, as the rabbis say. There's no luck, there's no fortune for Israel. We're not judged based off of birthright, based off of these uncontrollable factors, but rather, we make our own future, we make our own destiny, and we are able to actualize and take positions of power and influence and good in the world based off of what we're willing to do for the world, how much we're willing to put in and what we're willing to create. So I think the bracha, V'simcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'Menashe, more than just referencing great heroes of Judaism who we want our children to emulate, it's a statement of you should be great producers, people who contribute to the world, and you should be judged and evaluated and rewarded for your contributions, not just for your name or for something beyond your control. So I think it's a beautiful thing that isn't necessarily paralleled in the female bracha, but nonetheless, a great opportunity for equal bracha and equal representation. So not against the female bracha, just pointing out that the biblical contextual point here is somewhat specific to the Ephraim Menashe tension of subverting the firstborn. But fine, so we have this bracha. You should be like Ephraim Menashe, subverting the firstborn. Very good. Vayomer Yisrael Yosef, and Israel says to Yosef, Hinei Anochi mate, behold, I'm dying. V'yalohim imachem, v'shivatchem al eretz avatechem. And God will be with you, and He'll return you to your forefathers' land. Here now we have reference to Israel. But instead of saying you'll get the land of your forefather, you'll be the king of the land of your forefather, you'll inherit twice on the land of your forefather, which just has some sort of assurance that one day you'll go back to the land of your forefather. So he's not being given the full bracha of Abraham. The Abrahamic promise is that you will have dominion, you will own the land of Israel. Yosef is just being told you'll return to the land of Israel. And I'll give you a little bit extra on your brothers. I'll give you one more portion on your brothers. Which I have taken from the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. So this is a very interesting phrase that Yaakov says here. At the end of the day, he doesn't promise Yosef the entirety of the land, like he was promised, like Yitzchak, like Abraham. But rather, Yosef must be shocked to find out he's only getting a portion of the land. Well, we're used to this. For Yosef, this must have been so upsetting. He gets called in special with Jacob on his deathbed, gets told about the blessing from Abraham. There's this whole huge buildup that Yosef is now going to take over. His children, Ephraim and Menashe, are going to inherit. And what does he get? 2 portions of the land of Israel instead of 1. We're used to it, but for Yosef, this is a huge upset. This turns his world upside down. He's not going to be able to be the ruler of the Jewish people. He's going to share it. All he's going to get is a little bit more land. So I just want to note from the narrative perspective, the literary perspective, what's going on here. This is very significant. While we're all used to how the story plays out, while we're living with the story, we shouldn't be. And we should be surprised by the drama of finding out for the first time in history, in human history, God has allowed for his mission to be shared by a family instead of carried by one leader. So that's a huge shift and not what Yosef was expecting, not what the brothers were expecting. But I want to focus on one more peculiarity of this last verse before going a little bit more into the heart of what I want to discuss. Of course, it always takes 40 to 50 minutes to introduce what we're going to discuss together. We have this interesting phrase here, Shechem echad alachecha. We know that Shechem often means like a shoulder or a blade, like a shoulder blade. And some of the commentaries say, what's it mean, Shechem echad? It means one more shoulder, one more blade, one more large, important section. That all the brothers will get one section of Israel, you'll get one section, plus one more large piece. Now, other Meforshim point out that Shechem is also the name of a city in Israel. It's not just a description of a block of land, but also the name of a city. And it's not just a city, but it's a city that actually has a lot of significance. First of all, it's a city that's significant because Yosef was sold in Shechem. So, of course, there's this beautiful poetic irony or literary justice here that Yosef is sold in Shechem as the brothers try to kick him out of the family, get him out of the birthright, and deprive him his stake to Israel. So what happens? He gets his birthright and the city of Shechem. He gets even more than all the brothers, and what does he get more than the brothers? The city where they plotted to kick him out and deprive him of this birthright. So in one sense, that's very poetic, that's very beautiful, this idea that he's getting Shechem, where the plot was plotted to sell him, kill him, kick him out. But there's also, I think, something interesting about the fact that Shechem is also the place where the Dinah story happens, where Shimon loses his right to the Bechorah, where Levi loses his right to the Bechorah through their sin, through their violence. And more than that, we see this sort of reference explicitly in the verse, because what does Yaakov say? What's significant about this piece of land he's giving Yosef? Asher lekachti miyat ha'emori b'charbi v'kashti, which I conquered from the Amorites with my sword and my bow. When did Jacob ever go to war? Well, the only instance we know of war or military conflict with the family of Jacob so far is in the Dinah story when Shimon and Levi kill the city of Shechem. So it seems to some extent like Jacob is also referencing that, referencing the Dinah story, and explaining why Yosef will be receiving this portion. It could be that something about the Dinah story, we talked about the diplomacy, the national implications of the Dinah story, maybe that's relevant here too, as Yaakov talks to his son Yosef, a foreign viceroy, a foreign political leader, maybe. That's something interesting to think about. We're not going to fully explore. It could just be more simply that Yaakov is, again, repeating and emphasizing why Yosef is the one who deserves the right of the firstborn and not any of the other contenders. We know Reuben gets disqualified because he sleeps with Bilhah, Yaakov's wife. Shimon and Levi get disqualified because of their sin in Shechem by killing all of the people in Shechem. So perhaps Yaakov is saying, I'm going to give you that land because personally you have a stake to it, and because you're particularly suited to inherit, because the people in front of you in line got disqualified for their sin that they did there. So something is going on there. There's a lot of connotation with the invocation of Shechem, something to think about going forward. Why exactly is Shechem being referenced here? But so what we've seen so far is a section of Ephraim and Manasseh, and what we pulled so far is one theme of this, which is the theme of the broader context. Why is Ephraim and Manasseh an important way to end the story of Bereshit? Because it's the capstone of Bereshit. It's the Platonic ultimate expression of a subversion or reversal of the firstborn, which is an expression that birthright doesn't matter, but rather what you do with it. And that's an important way to end Bereshit, an important message. But I want to focus on just one more peculiarity in the story. We pointed out that Jacob says to Yosef, any children you've had after Ephraim and Manasseh, those aren't going to be tribes. Those are just going to be considered your children, and they'll inherit as part of Ephraim and Manasseh. We said, what other children? And in fact, it's actually a machlok, and it's a debate amongst the commentators. Did Yosef have other children? So Rashi says, "Moladaticha im tolidod." If you have future children, lo yiyu b'minyan banai. They won't be considered my children. So Rashi says it's not that Joseph had other children. Yaakov is simply informing Yosef, were you to have other children, they won't be considered tribes. I think this is strange in its own right, very peculiar and worth plumbing and exploring further. But even beyond that, I didn't quote them here, but most of the other Meforshim actually understand Yosef even had other children. Ephraim and Manasseh aren't his only two children. They're just the only two that were named. But he must have had other children. Otherwise, why would Jacob even bother saying it? All this is to say, if Joseph had other children, why are Ephraim and Manasseh getting this blessing? Why are they being singled out? And if Joseph didn't have other children, why is Jacob saying, why is he emphasizing, well, it's specifically Ephraim and Manasseh that are important, and if you have other children, they're not as important? What's going on? What is so special about Ephraim and Manasseh that they're picked to be the capstone, that they're picked to receive the blessing, and that they're elevated to be tribes, and no other children of Joseph are elevated to be tribes? So I think in response to that, yeah, George, please.
They're born in Egypt, not in Israel. And hence, to give him that extra portion, that gives him a reason to be attached to Israel.
Oh, beautiful. George just completely stole the share. He said exactly what I was building to. Beautiful, George. Exactly. George is pointing out, and we'll see this in the Psukim, that there is in fact something unique and peculiar about Ephraim and Manasseh. What is unique and peculiar about Ephraim and Manasseh? Well, Yaakov tells us himself in the verses. Look in verse Hey, and in verse Hey, in verse 5, Yaakov says to Yosef, Ata shnei banecha, your two children, hanoladim lecha be'eretz Mitzrayim. Just like George said, what's exceptional about the two children of Ephraim and Manasseh? They were born in Egypt.
Before he
Ad before I came, exactly, Lindy.
He
Exactly.
came. So that's a point.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like the simple implication is that since Jacob's arrived in Egypt, maybe Joseph had more children. Maybe his wife's pregnant, who knows? But Jacob's focusing on these two children were born in Egypt before we got here. In other words, yeah.
And according to the Midrash, they kept Torah. According to the Midrash, because it's not there, but according to the Midrash, Joseph taught them so that they would be able to keep whatever it was in the Torah that they could keep. Whereas they were born in a palace with opulence and non-Torah anywhere else around.
That is beautiful, and I hope to mention that Midrash. Spot on. I think that Midrash plays very nicely with the point we're developing here. Because what we see here is this huge emphasis on the fact that Ephraim and Manasseh were one born in Egypt and two born before Jacob came. And we have again, anyone born after that doesn't count. And further, we then go and we see that it's not just that they're born in Egypt. One sec. They're born in Egypt. And Joseph responds to the call to bring his children by saying, Asher natan li Elohim bazeh. Here are the children which God has given me, bazeh. And we pointed out when we first read it, that while it's unclear what bazeh means, Rashi says bazeh means with this, and Jacob must have pulled out his marriage contract. Rashi says harelo shtar erisin. Jacob pulled out his legal contract of marriage and said, "Look, these children are halachically married. I was halakhically married. These aren't mamzerim. These are good children." And he pulled out his shtar. Unkelis, and the more simple understanding, which is embodied in the translation by Sefaria, says, "What does bazeh mean? Bazeh means hacha, here. The children which were born here in Egypt." So Jacob says, "Bring me the children born in Egypt before I got here." And Joseph responds, "Bazeh, here are the children that were born here in Egypt." Because the operating factor, the prime factor here is exactly like George said, that these children were born in Egypt, not in Israel. That these will be the first tribes, the only tribes born outside of Israel. And that presents a problem. That presents a gap, a cultural gap between them and the rest of the Jewish people. They're born in a vacuum. Maybe they didn't even know they were Jewish. Who knows? Lindy's brings the Midrash, and we'll get to that, that Yosef was teaching them Torah. I think that's an important Midrash. Because I think what the Midrash is trying to address is exactly what we're discussing here. There is a huge cultural gap between Yosef and his family and the rest of the tribes. Yosef was an Egyptian. He was living in Egypt, a ruler in Egypt, culturally Egyptian. His wife was Osnat bat Potiphera. How much more Egyptian could one get? He's married to a princess of Egypt with the name Osnat. He's now given a new name. His name is now Tzafnat Paneach. He's changed his name, married an Egyptian woman, had Egyptian children. He is so Egyptian. And now Yaakov is meeting these two Egyptian men. He doesn't recognize them. He's never met them before. And what is Yaakov telling these two grown Egyptian men? You're going to inherit the land of Israel and be tribes of Israel. It seems so out of place. Jacob is feeling the gap between his grandchildren and the family tradition and legacy. When he's in Egypt looking at Ephraim and Manasseh, how can he help but feel these children have not grown up in a Jewish household? And it's not Jacob's fault for assuming as much, because we know from the names of Ephraim and Manasseh that Yosef is expressing his disconnect from his family. The Torah tells us here in Bereshit Mem Aleph, Genesis 41, Yosef yulad shnei vanim b'terem tavo shnat harav. Before the famine hit Egypt, when Joseph was living during the 7 years of plenty, living it up as the viceroy during a period of wealth, he had two children. Asher yalda lo Asnat bat Potiphera. The verse emphasizes for us, born to him by Osnat, this Egyptian daughter of Potiphera, this royal, noble, high-class Egyptian woman, Kohen On, the priest of On. So Joseph was doing well during 7 years of wealth, and during that period had two Egyptian children with a high-ranking Egyptian woman. And what does he call them? Yikra Yosef Hashem Bechor Menashe. Yosef calls the Bechor, again emphasized here, the role of the Bechor, this idea of the firstborn, which will later be reversed in the family. HaBechor Menashe, why does he call his firstborn Menashe? Ki nashani Elohim et kol amali et kol beit avi. Because God has made me forget my hard work and my father's household. The name Menashe itself expresses Yosef's distance from his family and his tradition. It's about him forgetting his tradition. And then, but Shem Hasheni Kara Ephraim, the second is called Ephraim. Why? Ki Hefrani Elohim be'eretz oni. God has made me fertile in the land of my affliction. It's a statement of how fertile, how well things are going in Egypt. Joseph's two sons, and perhaps Menashe more so than Ephraim, and maybe there's some significance there in terms of the future reversal between Menashe and Ephraim. But the two sons, their very names express Joseph's disconnect from his family and from Judaism. That he's in Egypt, thriving as an Egyptian, while when he was in Canaan living with his family, he was hated and beleaguered. He is doing well in Egyptian society, and his family is growing up in Egyptian society. And that's why the rabbis have to come and tell us, listen, I guarantee you he must have been teaching them Torah, because they're trying to push back against what we would have thought from reading the verses. We would have thought just from reading the Torah, oh, they're Egyptian. So we have to see, no, there's this tension here, that Yaakov cares and Yosef cares and Ephraim and Menashe themselves care about preserving the Jewish lineage and the Jewish family. They care about carrying on the Jewish tradition. And that's why we need this scene with Ephraim and Menashe. Because it's specifically these two sons who are born in Egypt who have less reason to feel connected, like George said, less reason to identify with the Jewish people, to identify with the Jewish nation. They need this extra chizuk, this extra reinforcement to ascend to the level of tribes. They need to be told, we value you as full brothers. You're fully part of this project, fully part of this mission, and you will be receiving land like the rest of them. Perhaps one could even argue that the fact that half of Shevet Menashe chooses to live on the other side of the Yarden, chooses to live on the other side of the Jordan in the book of Joshua, means that they never really succeeded. They never really fully got to the level of feeling fully integrated in the Jewish people. Because Menashe still wants distance. Menashe still wants to live on the other side of the Jordan, live far away for a little bit far distance from the land of Israel and the Jewish people. But those are the stakes. Yeah, George, I see you're raising your hand.
Yeah, the last sentence where it uses the earth oniyi.
Yeah.
How would you translate that word? I mean, obviously he's living a good life, not affliction, unless it's a spiritual affliction.
I assumed him an affliction referring to him being in jail, because the same land that put him in jail is the land that made him successful. So he's saying God made me fertile, made me successful in the land that had previously afflicted me. But it's a good point. Right now, he's certainly not afflicted. So it's a little bit ambiguous how to define that.
Rabbi, you just said that Menashe chose to live on the other side, but if correct me if I'm off the wall, but it seems as if when Moses said yes to, who was it, Gad and Reuben?
And half of Menashe. It's Gad, Reuben, and half of the tribe.
He also split. Moses split the tribe. And then by splitting the tribe and putting half on one side and half on the other side, it would make a connection so that the three tribes wouldn't just disappear totally.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That at the same time,
it doesn't say that they chose. I mean, maybe they did.
They ask Moshe if they can stay on the other side, and Moshe says, you can stay on the other side, but you have to lead the war. But only half of the tribe of Menashe even asked in the first place to stay on the other side.
Okay, because I didn't remember that. I could,
Yeah, if I'm wrong, for sure, shoot me an email and let me know with the psukim. But my recollection,
You're not done with Ephraim and Menashe, or you are done with them? Because I found here it says, Ephraim's upbringing was the source of his future greatness. Ephraim spent his life studying Torah, see Rashi, while Menashe was assisting Joseph with governing. So Ephraim was greater in that way, that due to the fact that the rabbis / Rashi say that he was studying Torah while Menashe was busy with the government.
Yeah. I think that Midrash is really hitting on part of what we're describing here too. This, both the reversal of the Bechorah, the reversal of the birthright, that ultimately it's Ephraim who merits it, and Midrash is saying, like Yaakov, he was a learner, he was dedicated to Torah, etc., so he merited it. I also think perhaps it's hitting on this point too, that Ephraim was the one who learned Torah. Ephraim was the one who was involved with the Jewish tradition, because Ephraim is going to be more successful as a Jewish leader. Exactly, spot on.
So I think I have a question too.
Yeah, please.
So, or comment, I'm not sure. So am I correct in seeing that at this point, we're sort of switching over to a system of meritocracy?
To some extent, I think obviously throughout the Torah, there's still a certain sense of divine election.
Right,
God
right.
still chooses kings.
But
God
we're
still
recognizing the value of a meritocracy or some kind of system that, and so it makes sense then that you would have to, that Menashe and Ephraim would have to merit this.
Exactly.
Honor.
And that's
Okay.
part of what Rashi and the rabbis are trying to explain. How does Menashe merit this?
Also that it's really important that they were there before Jacob came, because any children after the family came would then be indoctrinated or taught or shared or however you want to do that, due to the fact that the family itself was already there. Whereas if Joseph was able to teach these two children while they're in the palace, essentially, any of his traditions and any of what he grew up knowing before he got snatched away at the age of 17. That's why these two are so important, and the others are great to have.
Beautiful. It's spot on. I think so. Exactly. And just to abbreviate, because we always run out of time, I think perhaps this could also explain the mention of Rachel's death in this preface, that Yaakov is coming to Yosef and acknowledging the stakes are the future of the Jewish people and Yosef's family's role in the Jewish people. And he's referencing perhaps how beloved Rachel was, perhaps how rootless Yosef and his family are. They don't have their mother. They don't have Yaakov anymore. Yaakov's about to die. You need to work hard to ensure they preserve the traditions of your father and your mother. The invocation of Rachel's death is a reminder, perhaps, of how now Yosef is facing the death of his mother and father, two children born in a foreign land. It'd be so easy for them to never even know their grandmother, to never even know their grandfather, to forget the tradition, to forget Judaism, and forget the family. Yaakov is assuring you have to appreciate how important this is. You want to be the leader, you want your children to be the Pishnaim, to be the Bechorah, the birthright, then you have to ensure that they preserve the family tradition, perspective, and values. And just because we've run out of time, I'll say in a minute without looking at it inside, I think that is also why the very end of Sefer Bereshit is so focused and so fixated on burial. There's Jacob making Joseph swear that he'll be buried in Israel, Joseph making his brother swear that he'll be buried in Israel. There's Jacob asking Paro for permission to bury Jacob in Israel. So much, perhaps the majority of Parshat Vayechi, is obsessed just with burial. I think part of what's being described is this idea of the Achuzat Kever, the family burial, the family stake. Because like George mentioned by Rachel, and like we mentioned by Marat Machpelah, and the Torah and the Bible, burial isn't just burial, but it's both our financial claim and our familial legacy claim to Israel. It represents that we're a family with a plot and a burial spot, that we have long-standing roots, and that we have a serious, deep relationship with the land and with the country. So the burial being invoked here, both by Rachel, and also being invoked later by Yosef, by Yaakov, etc., is a claim to Jewish tradition and Jewish identity. That Yaakov is saying, I know you live in Egypt and you're doing well and things are great for you, and they weren't great at home. I know you were mistreated at home. I know the Jewish people haven't been a home for you. But if you want the Jewish people to survive, you and your children have to be Jews. You have to invest in your brothers. And the rest of Bereshit, where the tension between the brothers and Yosef over whether they have to protect, Yosef should protect them now that Yaakov's dead, the tension between Ephraim and Menashe and the rest of the tribe, all of this is expressed in this idea of needing to identify as Jews and not Egyptians, as Jews and not something else. And I think that that's really the way Bereshit ends, and that's the perfect, beautiful expression transition to Shemot, because that's where we pick up with Shemot. Shemot is the story of Moshe, who is being given the opportunity to identify as an Egyptian, who perhaps is growing up in an Egyptian palace, according to the Midrash. Minimally is growing up with the daughter of Paro, similar to Yosef, in the palace, in royalty, thriving as an Egyptian, who has to fight the idea of being an Ish Mitzri, as he's described by his future wife. To fight the idea of being characterized as an Egyptian, and really ascend to being someone who cares about his Jewish brethren. So I think the tension for all of Shemot is really led into the end of Bereshit. The Jewish people have finally reached familial peace. There's no longer infighting because we've now transitioned from a one-person model to a family model. all the tribes will share Israel, share the leadership, etc. But now that they're thriving in Egypt, will they reclaim their identity as a Jewish people? Will they return to Israel to populate that land? That's the drama that unfolds with the Moshe story, and that's where we leave off today.
Before you go out, Rabbi, before you,
Yeah, for sure.
I make this longer before you go out, because I went back to find out where Rachel died. I mean,
Yeah.
we all know that she was, but it doesn't say. It says, what it says is, he changes the name of the child from Ben, okay, thus Rachel died and this is in the art scroll. So, and it's not in Hebrew. You can read the Hebrew. Tell me what I'm missing. Thus Rachel died and was buried on the road to Ephrat, which is Bethlehem. Jacob set up a monument to her grave. It is a monument of Rachel's grave until today. And then Israel journey on. I looked it up in the Etz Chaim. I looked it up in the art scroll. So where is it that they brought the land?
Let me get back to you on that, because I'm actually pretty confident it does get mentioned, but it might not be mentioned.
You should know that it's Vayeshlach. It's 35, 19.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. So I'll pick up next year. Lindy and David, you guys will have to be here because I'm going to pick up next year with that. I'm going to look into that. For now, we're out of time. Feel free, as always, to email, call me, follow up with any questions anybody has. I'm going to exit now. I actually have to go for dinner with Shoshana. But thank you, everybody, for showing up. I hope that I added a little bit of insight to a very complicated Sefer Bereshit. And sorry, I have to go, but feel free, as always, to follow up with questions.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Love learning.
Regards to
Look forward
Shoshana.
learning Shemot next week with everybody. Have a good night, everyone.
you.
And please follow up if you have anything else to say.
See you next year.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
See you next year, all. Happy New Year's.
Happy.
Better New Year than last year. A better year than last.
Amen. Wait. What happened to Jeff?
Where's
Is it
Jeff?
Jeff with the,
No, Jeff wasn't here.
who
Yeah, he was
had
here.
who had the neck collar?
That was Jeff, I think, wasn't it?
It was?
I think it was.
Oh.
Yeah, I hope he's okay. I mean,
Risa, what happened to Jeff?
after his accident, I remember.
What?
He had an accident?
Oh, this was a while ago.
He had a bicycle accident a while ago, and he said that he did some kind of procedure or something
Oh. But he's okay,
last
right?
week.
I hope so. Yeah, God willing.
Hope so too.
Hi, Risa.
Hi, Risa.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
You're
You?
slaughtering me, Risa. You're slaughtering me, and you know that, right?
George?
Gina-
Not really.
Yeah, some of
We're
them.
talking about words with friends, right?
Yeah.
George, are you Hungarian by your name?
Who?
Yeah, George? You're not
Yes.
Hungarian, are you?
George?
I'm sorry?
George Kleiner.
Yes.
You're Hungarian, yeah?
Hungarian? No.
Okay, I thought by your name. It's a very common name among Hungarian Jews, Klein and George.
My parents came from an area of Poland